I'm sure you will all agree with me that that was an extremely helpful exposition, not only of an institution, a new institution that is bringing about change, but also, very importantly, giving us a very clear understanding of what is not changing. Now, no doubt many of you will have questions. I would just ask for your forbearance for a while longer. There will be a period and a panel discussion after the morning break, and an opportunity to pose questions that will clarify further the roles of not only ICAC, but, and this is what we're about to hear from our next presenters, an understanding of how other institutions that are involved with handling complaints might change and evolve in dealing with some of the transitional challenges that this institution, ICAC, presents. So the next person that we have the great pleasure to introduce is the Acting Commissioner of Police, Grant Stevens. Grant Stevens, APM, is currently the Acting Commissioner of Police South Australia in Gary Byrne's absence. However, his substantive role is the Deputy Commissioner of Police. The Deputy Commissioner of Police, Grant Stevens, is a career police officer, having joined SAPOL as a cadet at the tender age of 17. He became a detective early in his career and has accumulated more than 20 years' experience across SAPOL's crime branches. In that time, he has served in or led a number of metropolitan CIB teams and spent an important part of his career in specialist drug investigations. Deputy Commissioner Stevens' career highlights include creating and managing the Paedophile Task Force in 2003, which was established to investigate allegations of historic child sexual abuse, including SAPOL's Sexual Crime Investigation Branch in 2004. In 2010, Deputy Commissioner Stevens led a strategic project that developed and implemented SAPOL's neighbourhood policing teams concept as a means of increasing community engagement in our suburbs. He also developed a range of programs designed to enhance service delivery and deployment of police resources. In 2012, Mr. Stevens was awarded the Australian Police Medal for Distinguished Service. The role of Deputy Commissioner provides strategic management and leadership support to the Commissioner of Police and assists with the management of statewide police operations and activities. During times of emergency, the Deputy Commissioner provides support to the Commissioner of Police, acting as the state coordinator, and in the absence of the Commissioner of Police, can deputise as state coordinator. Mr. Stevens is also the South Australia Police representative on the National Counter-Terrorism Committee. Mr. Stevens, I invite you to address the audience. Thank you.
As has been explained, my role today is to give some insight into how South Australia Police has been involved in the investigation of corruption and serious misconduct issues in the past. I'm going to give some examples as to the sorts of investigations we have been responsible for conducting, and I'm also going to provide some explanation as to how we see the role of the Anti-Corruption Branch, our key corruption investigation body within SAPOL, continuing into the future in conjunction with the ICAC. It goes without saying that SAPOL is the primary investigative body in South Australia for any crime. Investigating criminal behaviour is what police are trained to do, and I think it's established by experience and reputation that we do that well. Corruption involving public officials is just another facet of criminal behaviour, and most people do the right thing and work with integrity and commitment. However, there's always the bad apple in the bunch that needs to be the subject of these investigations. Some people choose to think that their work-related behaviour is not criminal in the usual sense, but it involves any degree of corruption or even compromise of business security or good business principles to establish those issues of corruption. That's why police have been involved in the investigation of that type of behaviour across all levels of government in South Australia for quite some time. In fact, the Anti-Corruption Branch was established on the 23rd of February 1989. In that year, following recommendations of the July 1988 report of the National Crime Authority, the Police Minister established a separate SAPOL branch to identify and investigate corruption. That branch was tasked to investigate the corruption of public officials, investigate police corruption and misconduct, audit procedures and investigations, and assist government agencies to develop procedures designed to prevent or detect corruption. The Anti-Corruption Branch operated under ministerial directions which prescribed the conditions under which the branch would operate, and these related to the nature of investigations that would be conducted, the resources to be allocated by SAPOL to the Anti-Corruption Branch, and the management structure and reporting responsibilities of the Anti-Corruption Branch. An independent auditor was also appointed by the Governor to scrutinise the operations of the branch, and that is how SAPOL's Anti-Corruption Branch has functioned since that time. Now that South Australia has the ICAC, our ACB will continue to operate in association with the ICAC. We've been working closely with Commissioner Lander for the last 9 months as his project team established his office, and we are committed to supporting the ICAC operations within South Australia. With over 24 years' experience conducting corruption investigations, we have significant specialist skills and experience which we've agreed to share with the Commissioner and his team. Equally, we are keen to work with Commissioner Lander, who has the benefit of broader powers to investigate corruption, as you've just heard. In support of the ICAC, a number of SAPOL investigators have already been seconded, and we're in the process of finalising those numbers, as the Commissioner just elaborated on. And we're confident that the quality of the investigators we are providing to the ICAC will certainly be of tremendous benefit to the processes to be undertaken. We're very comfortable with the notion of sharing our trained and experienced investigators because we believe that this will maintain an important role within South Australia in relation to the investigation of corruption, and also allow SAPOL to share its expertise and the vast experience that we have developed over the last 24 years. So it brings to question the future for the Anti-Corruption Branch as a part of South Australia Police. The answer is that it's going to continue to operate as a specialist investigation branch, responsible and reporting directly to the Commissioner of Police. The directions, however, the ministerial directions that we've operated under, have been removed. They were removed on the 8th of September in relation or as a result of the ICAC commencing on the 1st of September. Commissioner Lander has the authority to refer corruption matters to SAPOL to investigate. In response, we've made a commitment to retain the Anti-Corruption Branch as a primary contact for the ICAC with responsibility for ensuring that these matters are fully investigated. There's also legislated provisions allowing the ICAC and SAPOL to conduct joint investigations, and that is where SAPOL will be able to make significant contributions to the investigations conducted by the ICAC into corruption in South Australia. We have significantly more resources available to us, as Commissioner Lander alluded to, and we will not hesitate to allocate those resources in order to ensure the effective investigation of matters referred to the ICAC. It's our belief that by working together, SAPOL and the ICAC can make a formidable team to investigate and deal with corruption. I'm also aware that our Anti-Corruption Branch investigators are looking forward to tackling the harder jobs that will be referred to SAPOL and working with the ICAC. They'll be providing investigational expertise where appropriate to support his authority to conduct examinations of witnesses and gather evidence. As has been alluded to, the coercive powers the Commissioner referred to are not available to police, but we believe those powers under the Act will provide significant potential to investigate corruption allegations much faster and gather evidence that previously was not accessible to corruption investigators. Multi-agency investigations are not new to SAPOL. We've routinely worked with the ACC, the AFP and other law enforcement agencies in Australia on secret and national security investigations, and our integrity in this regard has been tested and found to be at the right standard. Together we've achieved many good results, albeit these are usually not publicly made known due to the nature of the investigations that we are conducting. However, there are some examples I can provide that give some insight into the type of work that the Anti-Corruption Branch has conducted in the past. I've got 5 examples here I'd just like to briefly elaborate on that can give you some insight as to the type of work and the type of issues that are referred for corruption investigations. In 2008, we commenced a complex operation known as Operation Dexter, where outlaw motorcycle gang members had successfully involved a public servant in the Department of Transport in corrupt behaviour. The ACB identified that the employee within the Department of Transport had been involved for 2 years in unlawful issue of driver's licences, under false names and falsifying motor vehicle registration records. In 2009, that DTI employee was arrested, charged by police and pleaded guilty to 25 counts of corruption, and he was sentenced to a term of imprisonment. As a consequence of that investigation, another Department of Transport employee was identified and charged with criminal offences involving the removal of a defect from a motor vehicle, and this person was later found guilty and sentenced to a term of imprisonment. Following those events, the Anti-Corruption Branch worked with the Department of Transport to extensively audit their computer records. They found numerous instances of suspicious activity on the part of DTI employees. The following investigations resulted in the charging of another 34 people for offences involving corruption and bribery. 6 more DTI employees were dealt with by being charged, breaching the Code of Conduct for South Australian public sector employees, and appropriate penalties were issued to those people. Overall, the offending involved the unlawful removal of motor vehicle defect labels, the reclassification of driver's licences, or the issuing of driver's licences under false names. 27 motor vehicles were re-defected during the course of the investigation. Another successful Anti-Corruption Branch investigation was conducted in 2006, and it was known as Operation Bicep. It involved a raid on the home of a Finks outlaw motorcycle gang member, where 26 pages of internal confidential SAPOL records were found. ACB inquiries established the documents had been printed by a female SAPOL police officer who was in contact with members of the Finks outlaw motorcycle gang. Further investigations revealed this officer was accessing SAPOL databases on numerous people with links to various outlaw motorcycle gangs. She was also accessing SAPOL databases on a female who she suspected was having an affair with her husband and was releasing confidential information on driver's licence details to outlaw motorcycle gang associates. After the investigation, she was subsequently charged and arrested and convicted for a number of offences. You might be surprised to hear that this person didn't receive any financial or other benefit from her corrupt behaviour. It simply occurred because of her close personal relationships and loyalty to criminals. Often corruption is profit-driven, there's no denying that, and it's probably the expectation of most people that that is the underlying motive for people to engage in corrupt behaviour. Operation Wandori in 2010 was based on information from a member of the public who suspected that a private security agent was unlawfully receiving information from various sources to further his business. Anti-Corruption Branch investigations revealed that the person was operating a skip tracing business. This means he was locating people and motor vehicles who were the subject of confidential financial agreements where funds were outstanding on the loans. The private investigator had contacts within public and private agencies so he could corruptly source confidential information. He then used that information to find the addresses and vehicles of people for his private business interest and profit. At the end of the Anti-Corruption Branch investigation, 2 private investigators and 3 public servants were arrested for offences, and they were found guilty for those offences. It's not unusual for ACB investigations to involve other South Australia Police specialist crime areas or government agencies. For example, in 2005, in Operation Bearskin, the Anti-Corruption Branch received information from a public officer who suspected that a work colleague was in regular contact with a clerk within the Courts Administration Authority at Port Adelaide Magistrates Court. The reporting officer suspected that the work colleague and the court's employee were working together, accessing confidential departmental records and on supplying these records for a monetary fee to other unknown people. The Anti-Corruption Branch investigated and identified that the court's officer had suspiciously accessed computers on a number of occasions. At the time, SAPOL's Drug Investigation Branch and Australian Customs were jointly investigating a person suspected of being involved in the commercial importation of pseudoephedrine from Malaysia on behalf of outlaw motorcycle gang members. The person involved in these separate investigations were found to be close associates with the court's officer and providing confidential details of the SAPOL and Customs investigations to his associate. Anti-Corruption Branch arrested the court's officer for offences including abusive public office and attempt to pervert the course of justice. The other public servant, who was the work colleague of the reporting officer, was also arrested and charged with obstructing the course of justice. In 2007, both of these people pleaded guilty and were sentenced to terms of imprisonment. Final example, shows where ACB may be involved in assisting other agencies identify and remedy poor business processes that can lead to corrupt practices and criminal offences. And the example is Operation Atom, which we conducted in 2003. That investigation involved an office of the then Family and Youth Services where financial discrepancies were discovered. A full financial audit had showed $190,000 had been authorised by the manager of the office, in contrast to the Central Adelaide office of the same department, which had a total expenditure of $21,000 in the same period. The manager had been immediately suspended and Anti-Corruption Branch managed the complex financial investigation. The investigation found that the manager controlled cash payments for domestic violence issues, and there was a lack of evidence to support the existence of the clients to which those payments were being made. 59 clients' names were identified, with none of the clients' names recorded on any South Australia's driver's licences. They weren't recorded on SAPOL databases for domestic violence issues, and they weren't even recorded as being married in South Australia, nor having any dependent children. In fact, none of the clients could be located within South Australia. The manager had been employed in the position since 1994. Inquiries indicated that similar record management practices commenced as far back as 1996, with an estimated $1.3 million being expended by this manager from that branch office for so-called domestic violence payments. The manager was arrested and charged with offences of falsification of accounts and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. As a direct consequence of this ACB investigation, that government department had a whole department audit on family payments. As a result, numerous other bad business practices were identified, and another manager from a country office dismissed for suspected misappropriation of departmental funds totalling $30,000. So as you can see from those examples, corruption has many faces, and the motivations for acting in a corrupt manner has many origins. Finally, I'd like to say in closing that the community expects the public service of South Australia to act with honesty and integrity, and that is not too much to expect. The cases I've outlined today are just a few examples of how SAPOL, through the Anti-Corruption Branch, has been instrumental in identifying and taking action in many cases across the government sector in the last 24 years, and there are many more examples of effective investigations which have been conducted. At this point, I'd like to recognise the excellent work of other agencies that we've been working with, such as the Ombudsman, the Police Ombudsman, the Auditor General, all who play a significant part in ensuring integrity within the public sector. Those agencies have also worked very closely with the South Australia Police over many years, and we're very proud of the relationship that we have with those, and we expect a similar strong relationship with the OPI and the ICAC. Our commitment to the investigation and prevention of corruption has not diminished with the establishment of the ICAC in this state, and we expect that we will maintain the same level of resources to the Anti-Corruption Branch as we have done in the past, and look forward to being able to continue working in the area of corruption investigations. We're fully committed to working closely with Commissioner Lander, and will continue to work with other key agencies to support his operations, ensuring that corruption is detected and fully investigated, with corrupt public officials being put before the courts for their crimes. Thank you.
Well, for the next presenter is Irma Ranieri, Acting Commissioner for Public Sector Employment, Chief Executive, Change at South Australia, and Deputy Chief Executive for the Department for Manufacturing, Innovation, Trade, Resources and Energy, DMITRE. Irma has a number of different hats. She is Chief Executive of Change at South Australia. The programme was established to better prepare the South Australian public sector for the challenges and opportunities of the future. It aims to shape a culture that fosters a more confident and productive workforce, one that is more skilled and attuned to the drivers of citizen-centric service delivery. Irma is also the Deputy Chief Executive of Strategy and People and Culture of DMITRE. She leads significant organisational change, strategic policy and leadership development. Irma plays an important role in shaping the culture and values of this agency. Irma has recently been appointed as the Acting Commissioner for Public Sector Employment for a period of 4 months. She was elected president of the IPAA in August 2012 and is currently the chair of the Industry Advisory Board and the Centre for Human Resource Management at UniSA. Irma has more than 30 years' experience and has published papers in management journals on job sharing and presents at national forums on organisational culture, values, change and leadership. Irma.
Yes, I have a number of roles, and on the 2nd of September I started my acting Commissioner for Public Sector Employment role. So in terms of talking about the ICAC and what it actually means for the Commissioner for Public Sector Employment, I intend to develop a very close relationship with Commissioner Lander to work on that. What I thought I'd do is actually break up my presentation into two parts. One is for those, and there's quite a few public sector employees in the audience, is actually to talk a little bit about the role of the Commissioner for Public Sector Employment. And I think I'll probably be repeating some of the things that the Commissioner Lander talked about, but I think it's important to put in context what we already have and have been operating under anyway. So the Commissioner for Public Sector Employment really oversees the Public Sector Act 2009. It provides an employment framework that is driven by a set of principles and guides the day-to-day employment matters of public sector employees. The statutory functions, which I'm learning every day, of the Commissioner for Public Sector Employment are defined by the Act. The role also includes advancements of the objects and principles of the Act and promotion of their observance within the public sector. And for those of you that have been in the sector for a while, they would know that we have a code of conduct, the ethics for the South Australian public sector. We issue determinations, we monitor and report to the Minister on how we observe all of these. We issue guidelines by the Commissioner on employment matters, and it provides an advisory role. And I think all of these elements are actually quite important for the ICAC. So it's business as usual, and we all pay attention, I guess, through those determinations and the advisory role about what good conduct is in the public sector. We also provide advice on conduct and review those matters as required for the Premier or the Minister, and we do investigate or assist in investigations on matters or practices within the public sector employees' contexts and contracts. So that brings me, I think, to how we then work closely with the ICAC Act, and in particular with OP and ICAC. So the Commissioner may refer a matter which raises a potential issue of misconduct and maladministration in public administration to the Commissioner for Public Sector Employment in its capacity as an inquiry agency. So when the referral is made, the Commissioner may give directions or guidance to the agency or exercise the powers of the agency in respect to the matter. And in the absence of contrary direction from the Commissioner for Public Employment or any other inquiry agency can operate under specific directions. In my capacity, over the next 4 months, I must report to the OP, which you've already heard, any matter that the Commissioner for Public Sector Employment reasonably suspects involves corruption in public administration, serious or systemic misconduct in public administration, serious or systemic maladministration in public administration, or misconduct or maladministration in public administration in the office of the Commissioner for Public Sector Employment. That hasn't changed. So in fact, it just actually, I think, raises a level of transparency with OP and ICAC. So we may report to OP any other matter that the Commissioner considers appropriate, and the report must be made as soon as possible, as you've heard. What constitutes serious or systemic? The nature and circumstances of the allegations, including the number of allegations, the degree of organisation and planning, for example, steps taken to cover up conduct, the status of the person involved, the harm or potential harm to an individual or government resulting from the matter, including physical, financial or other harm. And you've heard from Grant some of the things that can actually occur in public office or with public sector employees. So it can be quite complex. And whether the matter is widespread and involves more than one agency and occurs on a frequent basis. It involves a senior public officer. Involves alleged misconduct or maladministration that has resulted in a substantial loss or damage to assets, involves allegations that would, if proved, bring an agency or the Crown into disrepute, or is otherwise of particular prominence or importance. That it causes widespread disruption to services or programs, affects a number of persons, is spread throughout the agency or authority, or is otherwise accepted or condoned, or involves a large sum of public money. Now, that's kind of the more official presentation from me. I think what actually, from my experience, and I'll put my other hat on in terms of reform across government, is a lot of the things that I would suspect that the Commissioner for Public Employment, and certainly my previous roles in managing investigations, is that there are a lot of grey areas in relation to misconduct and the operations of people working in public office. So, one thing that I do want to talk about is actually the Code of Ethics, and it is the Code of Conduct for the purposes of the Act. It embodies and actually builds on the principles of the Act, and in doing so it advances the objects of the Act in pursuit of good governance. It's often hard in the Code of Ethics to kind of work out what we mean when we talk about integrity or professionalism, and I think that's where my interest in particular lies. So the Code of Ethics seeks to guide and support public sector employees in all of their professional activities. It strengthens public confidence in the public sector. It earns respect from citizens, so in fact they would uphold us to those Code of Ethics, to government and employees for the public sector as an institution which is critical to good government in South Australia. And I guess if taxpayers believe that we should behave in a particular way, then we should reciprocate. And the same goes, I guess, for people working within their own agencies and how they expect to be treated. And it sets out standards of professional conduct expected in every public sector employee. I guess the challenge basically is to then actually expand a bit further the Code of Ethics and the principles within the code to start talking about a set of values and behaviours that we can actually, as public sector employees, understand a bit better and actually start to integrate, I guess, in the discussions that we have, not only within our own agencies, but how the public should expect us to behave, which leads me to talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing through Change at South Australia. The program, as you heard in the introduction, is on actually, the focus is on managing change and the way we actually go about doing business in government. There is a focus on doing things better and actually becoming even more citizen-centric and maybe changing the way we deliver our services in government, but more importantly, empowering public sector employees to actually take risks, lead change and do things differently. Now, there's probably a little bit of conflict between, I guess, what's happening with ICAC and for us to take some of those risks and perhaps not be worried about where the lines might be drawn. So what we've done is actually engaged in a fairly extensive process of actually talking about values and behaviours with the public sector, and we've touched probably around 1,000 people who have become champions around developing these values and behaviours. We're developing a toolkit that will actually give people a bit more of an idea about how you embed values and behaviours in the organisation. My belief is that the Code of Ethics is a very good start, a very good foundation, but it may not go far enough in terms of how do we actually implement that? Where are the grey areas and how do we do that effectively in our job and in the way we actually behave, in the way we manage people and in the way we actually manage the public? And the way we're actually doing that is through 90-day demonstration projects. So we get an idea, we try and solve something in 90 days, but the important bit of those 90-day projects is how we actually go about doing that, how we collaborate with other agencies, how we demonstrate the values of integrity, of transparency, and actually taking risks. So we are actually experimenting on a number of fronts in relation to that. The next stage is actually to implement those values and finally to actually integrate them into the Code of Ethics. So what we've actually done in that engagement piece is actually come up with clustering those values through the Code of Ethics. So the personal values of honesty and integrity, courage and tenacity, are the individual traits that we bring to work, and these were voted on, and public sector employees said that we think these are important in the work that we do, but we go further in terms of describing what those practices, organisational practices and the behaviours, and more importantly the taboos are, which are the things that we shouldn't be seeing in relation to some of these values. They focus on the professional values, on collaboration and engagement, trust, respect, service and professionalism. And just leaving them at words doesn't go far enough. So we actually are looking at how we describe them a bit further, and they will be out with the toolkit, and then implementation around those values will occur. And sustainability, making sure that our services and policies provide maximum value for minimum resources, so doing things differently to make sure that we sustain things over time. And I heard the Commissioner talk about education and awareness, and I think it's around culture and how we do business is where I think we need to actually focus some of that education and awareness. And I look forward to actually working quite closely with ICAC and the Commissioner and OPI around how we can actually start to talk more about the things that are in the grey areas in relation to values and behaviours and conduct, and how then we can hold people accountable for that. Because as we know, for those that do work in the public sector, there are some places where the systems are there, where people are held to account not only on the things that they have to produce at the end of the day, but how we actually do that. So those values and behaviours have to be an integral part of how we assess performance. So what we've done, we have had a big education and awareness piece, and I'd like to see how we can actually build on that with some of the things that OP and ICAC need to do. So we've actually had a journey from the 5th of November 2012 where the Cabinet, including the Premier and Chief Executives, had decided on a set of 7 or 10 values. They also decided on a set of organisational practices, behaviours and taboos. So it started at the very top, but we can't, as you know, implement those values and behaviours without the input of people that are expecting to either demonstrate those values or come on board with them. So people need to actually have some input into how those values look for them in their particular organisations. So this diagram just talks to you a little bit about how we've gone about engaging the public sector. We've had online discussions, we've had face-to-face workshops like this, we've had a process where people have been able to vote on which ones they believe should be upheld by the public sector, and it doesn't diminish the Code of Ethics. What it does do is build on and expand on them. An example of what it would look like in terms of the toolkit and what we expect people to implement. This is just a sample of how we're describing one particular element, which is around working as a service that's defined for the citizens and the outcomes for citizens. And as you can see, we have a set of behaviours, a set of practices and a set of taboos. It just goes a bit further. And our aim is to actually do something a little bit further with the Code of Ethics and embed it and make it mandatory, I think, within performance discussions. How have we gone about engaging, I guess, the most senior people and then others to implement? So we've had Senior Management Council. For us, it's the public sector agency senior executives, chief executives. They are our values champions, and we've had Alan Holmes in particular, who was involved in the drafting of the Code of Ethics, be the champion for what the values, behaviours and taboos would look like going forward. There has been a major awareness raising strategy that's targeted at all public sector employees. We have developed a discussion guide that will be developed for use for all middle managers, high-level managers and staff to know what is expected of them. And as I said before, what's critical here is how we embed these and make people accountable within their own systems, within organisations, to uphold these values and behaviours in particular, to not demonstrate those taboos. And agencies can integrate them in a way that actually speaks to the values and behaviours at work that they've already done within their own agencies. They will be written into the Code of Ethics, and that will be my task over the next 4 months, is to actually look at those 8 core values alongside the professional standards of conduct and democratic values, accountability, service to ministers and other things. They will set the performance values alongside with the compliance values, and we're hoping to have them released probably sooner than November. We'll have the values released and the discussion about implementation. We're hoping to redraft the Code of Ethics either by the end of this year or early next year. So I just wanted to end my presentation by saying that there is that sort of statutory role of the Commissioner for Public Employment, but in my experience, we do need to have a discussion, I think, about the areas that people find very difficult to assess as to whether it's misconduct, the bullying complaints, the trying to manage performance and the rest of it, and get clearer about what you as senior officers can do and those employees and what their rights are in relation to behaviours that aren't often articulated well enough. And we need to keep having that conversation about how that will actually happen with a little bit more detail going forward in the future. So I do look forward to working with the Commissioner not only on the investigations and how we might actually develop a closer working relationship and transparency about doing that, but more importantly playing a significant partnership role in the education and awareness raising for public sector employees in particular. And then I look forward to Warren coming back in January when we've covered all of that and done all the work. Thank you very much.
Very much, Irma. Very interesting talk, and a very important one in terms of putting on the agenda, I think, the culture change implications that need to be engaged with and the challenges that that bring to the way in which organisations respond to to meeting the obligation to perform in acceptable ways that are clearly not corrupt. Well, our next speaker is Richard Bingham, the South Australian Ombudsman. Richard was appointed to that role on the 1st of June 2009. Before that, he was chair of the Tasmanian Electoral Commission from when it was established in 2005 and independent assessor for the redress process for people who suffered abuse in state care in Tasmania. Richard was Secretary of the Tasmanian Department of Justice from 1994 to 2004 and acted as Ombudsman and Health Complaints Commissioner there in 2005-2006. Richard.
Thanks very much, Kim, and thanks, if I can start by adopting the acknowledgements and thanks that others have previously made. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you to IPA for that. I thought it would be most useful today if I spoke about a couple of things. Firstly, a comparison and a contrast, if you like, between the respective roles of the Commissioner, ICAC and OPI, and the Ombudsman, and also an explanation about some of the other legislative changes that are made by the ICAC Act to things that are near and dear to my heart. There are some interesting things hidden away in the schedule to the Act. But let me start with some similarities between the Commissioner and the Ombudsman. And if I can pick up the comments that the Commissioner made at the conclusion of his address about independence. Both the Commissioner and the Ombudsman are independent statutory officers appointed following an inquiry process by the Statutory Officers Committee of the Parliament. In the case of the Ombudsman, it's still necessary for there to be a resolution made by both Houses of Parliament, although that's not necessarily the case in relation to the Commissioner. It's sufficient if the Statutory Officers Committee approves the appointment or doesn't object to it in the case of the Commissioner. The second similarity is that both the Commissioner and the Ombudsman are accountable to the Crime and Integrity Policy Committee of Parliament. This committee has been newly created through the ICAC Act, but as far as I know, its membership hasn't been determined as yet. So far as the Ombudsman's concerned, the new committee replaces the Statutory Officers Committee, which used to be required to report annually on the operation of the Ombudsman's office. And it's salutary to note that the new committee has a responsibility to examine every Ombudsman report that's tabled in the Parliament, not simply, as the Statutory Officers Committee had, an obligation to conduct an annual review of the operation of the Ombudsman's office. Either House of Parliament or indeed a parliamentary committee can refer a matter to the Ombudsman for investigation and report. That's happened on 2 occasions so far during my term of office, but it can only be referred by that House of Parliament or parliamentary committee if it is within the Ombudsman's jurisdiction. There's no equivalent provision for that parliamentary referral in relation to the ICAC. Further, the Crime and Integrity Policy Committee is expressly excluded from investigating a matter relating to particular conduct or reconsidering a decision of the Commissioner or any other person or body. That includes the Ombudsman. So, to some differences between the 2 offices. Well, let's start with the most obvious. The Ombudsman's been around for 40 years in South Australia. It's the second oldest Ombudsman office in the country behind Western Australia, and we are 10 years in this case behind New Zealand, which is the oldest Ombudsman office in the Western, in our hemisphere. The Ombudsman itself as a concept originated about 200 years ago in Scandinavia. But apart from those differences, there's a more significant difference in relation to the jurisdiction of the 2 bodies. As we've heard, the jurisdiction of ICAC's contained within the definition of 3 terms: corruption in public administration, misconduct in public administration, and maladministration in public administration. I'll deal with each of these 3 limbs in terms and what the Ombudsman's role is by contrast. Well, the first one's pretty easy. The Ombudsman has no role in investigating corruption. In common with many other public sector agencies, where a disclosure is made under the Whistleblowers Protection Act that relates to fraud or corruption, we've always been obliged to pass that information on as soon as practicable to the anti-corruption branch of SAPOL. That obligation still exists, and that's a word of warning for all of us, I think. It's not necessary only to comply with the Commissioner's directions in relation to reporting corruption. It's also necessary to comply with the obligation in the Whistleblowers Protection Act to report corruption to the ACB. I'd echo Grant Stevens' comments about the way in which my office and the ACB have worked together up to this point, and I'm looking forward to the continuation of that relationship in concert with ICAC and OPI. But if we put if we put corruption to one side, it's possible that the Ombudsman jurisdiction can be invoked. And in contrast to ICAC and OPI, the Ombudsman jurisdiction revolves around the twin concepts of an administrative act on the part of an agency to which the act applies. In the initial consideration of whether the Ombudsman has jurisdiction, there's no suggestion of possible fault in the way there is with misconduct or maladministration in ICAC terms. Hence, unlike ICAC, there's no need for the concept of reasonable suspicion before the Ombudsman has jurisdiction. As we've heard, the ICAC directions and guidelines require that there be a reasonable suspicion of corruption or misconduct before there's an obligation to report. But an Ombudsman investigation is targeted towards administrative error, and I'll talk more about that later too. But first, let me mention the second limb of the ICAC jurisdiction, which is misconduct. ICAC misconduct is broadly defined. It means a contravention of a code of conduct by a public officer while acting in his or her capacity as a public officer that constitutes a ground for disciplinary action, or other misconduct of a public officer while acting in his or her capacity as a public officer. That last paragraph, that last limb, covers pretty much anything that you or I might do at work. By contrast, there's no definition of misconduct in the Ombudsman Act, and thus we use the ordinary dictionary meaning of the term. In general terms, I've got an obligation to report any evidence of breach of duty or misconduct on the part of a public officer which I might uncover during an investigation to the principal officer of the agency, be that the Chief Executive Officer in the case of a State Department or the Mayor in the case of a council. It's the responsibility of that principal officer to deal with the consequences of the finding of the breach of duty or misconduct. But the ICAC Act itself conferred a specific new misconduct jurisdiction on the Ombudsman in relation to elected members of local government councils. This now extends not just to conflict of interest, as used to be the case under the old provisions of the Local Government Act, but also to any breach of an elected member's general duties, to any failure to comply with the new single legislated elected member code of conduct, or any failure to comply with the elected member's register of interest provisions. In some ways, this is a curious situation. On the one hand, Parliament has conferred jurisdiction on the ICAC Commissioner in relation to a very broad range of conduct which falls within the definition of other misconduct by a public officer. On the other hand, in the same Act, it's required that no proceedings can be taken in relation to the initiation of district court proceedings arising from misconduct by an elected member of a council unless another body, that is the Ombudsman, has first investigated the matter. That's what the ICAC Act has done, and the directions and guidelines deal with the issue by requiring me to report only a reasonable suspicion of serious or systemic misconduct to OPI. So anything which falls short of that, but which is a misconduct by elected members of councils, will remain essentially within the Ombudsman's jurisdiction. There are similar subtleties in relation to the third limb of ICAC's jurisdiction, namely maladministration in public administration. Whilst it doesn't appear in the Ombudsman Act, maladministration is a term which is often applied to the Ombudsman jurisdiction. It's not one that I warm to because I think it's imprecise, and since I've been Ombudsman we haven't been using it. We've instead been using a shorthand phrase, unlawful, unreasonable or wrong, to describe the various types of administrative error under the Ombudsman Act. The ICAC term maladministration in public administration encompasses two elements. The first is irregular and unauthorised use of public money or substantial mismanagement of public resources. The second is simply substantial mismanagement. These elements seem to be derived from definitions in the Whistleblowers Protection Act about what constitutes a protected disclosure. And in my view, they're quite restricted. The use of the term substantial mismanagement suggests a level of seriousness which goes well beyond a simple administrative error, and many administratively erroneous acts occur without the irregular and unauthorised use of public monies. By contrast, an Ombudsman Act unlawful, unreasonable or wrong finding can be made in respect of any administrative act by an agency to which the Act applies. As I said, we look for administrative error, or what I call the 7 administrative sins, which reflect long-standing notions of good administration at common law. And here they are. The first point to note about the 7 administrative sins is that they don't encompass policy matters, and this is the essential definitional characteristic of what is an administrative act. The Supreme Court in South Australia said in 1990 that the Ombudsman has no jurisdiction in relation to policy matters, and to that extent what is an administrative act excludes anything which is properly described as policy. Those administrative acts, though, can be directed towards, and there can be an administrative error in any of these 7 ways. The act may be done in a way which is contrary to law. That's fairly self-evident. It can be unreasonable, unjust, oppressive or improperly discriminatory. We shorten that down to unreasonable, and we apply a test of Wednesbury unreasonableness, which sets a fairly high bar for whether an act is unreasonable. An act may also be an administrative error if it's done in accordance with an unreasonable, unjust, oppressive or improperly discriminatory law or practice. In some respects, I think this sits oddly with the admonition from the Supreme Court that the Ombudsman doesn't pronounce on policy matters. If I can find that an act was done in accordance with an unjust or oppressive law or practice, it's very difficult to do that without reflecting on the policy behind that law or practice. And I think that administrative error is in fact a broad invitation to get involved in administrative acts which are, if not wholly of a policy character, then certainly heading down that path. An administrative error can also occur if an act is done for an improper purpose or based on irrelevant grounds, or if reasons are not given for the decision. That's in contrast to the situation at common law, where the High Court said that there isn't an obligation to provide reasons for a decision. Notwithstanding that High Court decision, it can still be the basis for a finding of administrative error under the Ombudsman Act. An act can also be an error if it's based wholly or in part on a mistake of law or fact, or, and this is the best one, whether it's wrong. I like the fact that this is a concept that was introduced in 1972, and presumably what was wrong in 1972 in terms of our expectations of public sector administration standards was different from what our expectations are today. If you think about matters such as community engagement, public consultation, and indeed ethical standards, I think the standards which we apply today are likely to be higher and tougher than they were in 1972, and in this way the Ombudsman Act enables that flexibility and the application of contemporary standards. But clearly these administrative sins represent a very different scope to the ICAC substantial mismanagement or irregular and unauthorised use of public monies, and the Ombudsman's jurisdiction, I think, is wider, and I am able to investigate administrative acts which are not within the investigative jurisdiction of ICAC. But whilst the Ombudsman's jurisdiction is broader in this respect, there are some other important limitations on the Ombudsman which don't apply to ICAC. These limitations arise where a complaint is made to the Ombudsman. They don't apply in the case of an own initiative investigation, in the case of a parliamentary resolution where there is a referral from the Parliament, and it's probably the case that they don't apply where a matter is referred to the Ombudsman by OPI, though as you'll hear, this is still something that we need to work through in relation to references to my office. But these limitations are ones which indicate that they revolve around the complainant, if you like, and aspects of the complainant. The complaint must not have come to the complainant's notice more than 12 months before it's lodged, although I've got a discretion to investigate a complaint. That seems to me to be proper in all the circumstances. The complainant must not have an alternative remedy available, although again I have a discretion to investigate the complaint if I form the opinion that it's not reasonable for the complainant to have to exercise that remedy. The complainant must be directly affected by the administrative act to which the complaint relates, or if the administrative act is done in the agency's capacity as the employer of the complainant, it's not within my jurisdiction. In each case, these limitations are expressed in mandatory terms. The Ombudsman Act specifies that I must not investigate if that particular limiting factor exists. So that's an outline of the jurisdictional stuff. How does it all play out in practice? Well, here are some figures on the number of matters which we dealt with last financial year. To summarise the significance of that table, of the nearly 12,000 approaches which we received last financial year, 3,067 were Ombudsman Act complaints. 162 of those complaints resulted in a preliminary investigation, and of those 162, we found administrative error on 64 occasions. In other words, I considered that, after my office had conducted what can amount to a fairly detailed assessment, 2,905 complaints, or 95% of the complaints within my jurisdiction, did not warrant a formal investigation by my office. In many of those matters, my office was able to achieve a satisfactory resolution without commencing an investigation, through providing advice, through referring the complainant back to the agency, or through informal conciliation. And I'd like to make a comment here about what I call frequent flyers, or those who are well known to all of the investigative jurisdictions in the state. It's been my experience that we have to tread very carefully before saying that just because a matter comes from a particular complainant, that it therefore follows that it is vexatious or frivolous or trivial. In my experience, it is sometimes the 237th complaint, which is the one that has some validity, and we have to be very careful to not close our minds to that possibility. Not surprisingly, this is a subject which has exercised the minds of ombudsmen around the country for some time, and there is published on my website the results of a joint project from ombudsmen around the country about managing unreasonable complainant conduct. And the key messages that I take from that project are firstly to separate out the issue from the individual and to make sure that we are treating these frequent flyers and every matter that they bring to them, we look at the substance of the matter rather than the person who's bringing it. And secondly, that we are very clear about managing expectations, because much of the unreasonable complainant conduct that I come across occurs where people haven't been clear about what the expectations are, and people sometimes quite rightly have fallen foul of those misplaced expectations. But this slide and the differences, the numbers of matters that we deal with and the nature of the matters points to an important difference in focus between ICAC and Ombudsman work. As the Commissioner said, the primary object of his legislation is investigative, that is, preparing a brief of evidence for a potential prosecution. The Act says explicitly that the Commissioner's primary object should be to investigate serious or systemic corruption in public administration and to refer serious or systemic misconduct or maladministration to the relevant body. Commissioner's also got a very important preventive and educative role and gives directions and guidance to and evaluates the practices, policies and procedures of inquiry agencies such as the Ombudsman and public authorities. By contrast, at Ombudsman SA, investigation is only one element of complaint resolution. Conciliation, for example, is another. Whilst I rarely exercise the formal conciliation power provided by the Ombudsman Act, conciliation is at the heart of the early resolution that occurs with the 95% of the complaints which I mentioned which don't make it to investigation. Further, the focus of an Ombudsman investigation is to make findings and recommend a remedial outcome. I make findings and recommendations for administrative improvement, and I don't collect evidence for prosecutions. My broad aim is the same of most of you here, I would guess. That is to ensure and enhance the standard of public administration in this state for the benefit of the South Australian people. There's another significant difference between ICAC and the Ombudsman in the fact that my office undertakes the external review under the FOI Act. Apart from sending a good message about transparency generally, the fact that the two jurisdictions are carried out by one office, in my view, is significant for two reasons. First, there is considerable synergy between the jurisdictions. In both cases, I'm making judgments about where the balance of the public interest should lie. There's often overlapping content as well. The subject of an Ombudsman Act complaint frequently is closely related to an FOI application. Examples include the report on state planning procurement processes concerning Mount Barker, which I released earlier this year. Second, there's a benefit in applying some practical techniques across the two jurisdictions. Because there's an appeal right to the District Court from my FOI determinations, that process is necessarily more legalistic than many Ombudsman investigations would otherwise need to be. However, that more legalistic approach can assist in ensuring the necessary rigour in more significant investigations. Having two jurisdictions also gives me and my staff the opportunity to work across them. I think this is beneficial for my health and sanity, and it appeals to my Gemini nature. The final difference in focus of work is the conduct of audits. Over the last 3 years, I've conducted audits of complaint handling in the Department of Correctional Services and in local government, and in relation to meeting and document confidentiality in local government. Whilst the ICAC has power to evaluate public authority practices, policies and procedures, this must be done with a view to advancing comprehensive and effective systems for preventing or minimising corruption, misconduct and maladministration in public administration. There's no similar specific purpose required under the Ombudsman Act. I can conduct an audit simply if I think it's in the public interest to do so. In pursuance of that power, we're currently doing an audit in relation to the implementation by state departments of the FOI Act. The next area in which I like to contrast the approach of the two pieces of legislation is in relation to the respective powers of ICAC and the Ombudsman. As we've heard, ICAC has extensive investigatory powers, as you would expect. They encompass all sorts of search and powers and retention orders, also powers under the Listening and Surveillance Devices Act and in relation to telecommunications interception. But in my understanding, these powers can only be exercised in respect of corruption investigations. It seems to me that this means that the Commissioner will need to form a reasonable suspicion of corruption before the wide powers become available, and I don't envy his ability to exercise coercive powers only in respect of one element of his jurisdiction. In my experience, it's often not until after all the evidence is collected that I'm able to form a view about the nature of the administrative error which is in issue. And by contrast to the ICAC situation, under the Ombudsman Act, Royal Commission powers are available in any investigation into any administrative act. I very rarely need to use the powers, but their existence is very helpful on occasions. If the Commissioner should decide that he needs such powers to investigate misconduct or maladministration in public administration, it seems to me that he will need to exercise powers under the Ombudsman Act because none exist under the ICAC Act. He's perfectly entitled to do this, and I would welcome it if he does, under the provisions of the ICAC Act. But the same jurisdictional limits apply, and there needs to be an identifiable administrative act, that is not something that engages in policy, and an agency to which the Ombudsman Act applies. The final area of contrast relates to confidentiality in the conduct of investigations. Here the differences are perhaps not so great, but they are still significant. As we've heard, in relation to an ICAC investigation, it's an offence to mention that a matter's been referred to OPI or ICAC. Investigations are to be conducted in private. In most cases, there'll be no publication of the results of an investigation, namely the brief of evidence to be provided to the prosecutor. And during the course of an investigation, only very limited public comment is anticipated to be made. By contrast, in an investigation under the Ombudsman Act, I must conduct the investigation in private. I have a statutory obligation to report to the complainant about the result of an investigation. Where I find error, I'm obliged to publish a report to the principal officer of the agency and to the relevant minister, and I may publish the report in any other manner which I see fit if I'm of the opinion that it's in the public interest to do so. I can also make any other public comment about an investigation where I'm of the opinion that it's in the public interest for me to do so. And I'd just interpolate there that I endorse the views that the Attorney and the Commissioner expressed about the benefits of investigations being conducted in private. That's always been the way in which investigations under the Ombudsman Act have been conducted, and I view somewhat quizzically those jurisdictions where investigations are conducted much more in the sort of public forum. That doesn't seem to me to be a productive way to get to the bottom of what's gone on, nor to encourage, from the perspective of the fixing things for the future way that the Ombudsman Act requires me to operate. I will quickly through the rest of the slides that I've got. Firstly, if I can deal with reports by the Ombudsman to OPI, it's unlikely, I think, that we will be reporting significant numbers of matters to OPI. This is because so far we've referred 7 matters of the 150 odd that OPI has received, and some of those go back quite some considerable distance. It's also clear that ICAC and the ACB will continue to deal with any matter that may involve corruption, that I need to report any such matter to both OPI and the ACB. In relation to misconduct and maladministration matters, those figures that I put up earlier would suggest that if we only found formal administrative error in 64 matters, I don't expect there'll be many occasions when the ICAC and Ombudsman's respective responsibilities will intersect. In terms of referrals to the Ombudsman from OPI, the Commissioner foreshadowed that some of these are on their way, but they haven't made it to me yet, so it's very early days. But I will make a couple of brief comments just in anticipation. The first of them revolves around the necessity for us in each case to make sure that we are both working within our respective jurisdictions, and that will be a matter for the consultation which is required to occur between the Commissioner and the Ombudsman before a referral, but we will be certainly keen to make sure that there's no suggestion that any reference goes beyond our jurisdictions. In relation to the other matters that I mentioned about the amendments to other pieces of legislation tucked away in the schedules, the amendments to the Ombudsman Act, I'll list them there very briefly. They do relate to some important things about the confidentiality matters which I've canvassed. In relation to the amendments to the Local Government Act, essentially this revolves around the single code of conduct and the ministerial referral of complaints against members of councils to my office for investigation. It's also the case that there will be no more Burnside investigations in the nature of the one that was conducted a couple of years ago, because any ministerial investigation of the Council of Subsidiaries is now to be undertaken by my office. I'd like to conclude with some thoughts from Queensland. I declare an interest because I have a close associate who was very much involved in the formulation of the system that operates in Queensland a long time ago. His involvement was. But just recently there's been a review by the former High Court Judge Ian Callanan and Professor Aroney. As a consequence of that review, there is the Queensland Government is undertaking its own reassessment of the integrity system in that state. This slide is a summary of the suggestions that came from an information paper published by the Department of Premier and Cabinet in that state, and I think it provides some good advice for us about how we should make the system here operate. In terms of the things that we need to seek to achieve, I think what works well in the current Queensland system is a good outline of what we need to seek to achieve, and of the things that we need to avoid. I think the problems that are listed there, confusion about who does what, undermining accessibility, time delays and duplications, are things which we would be well advised to keep our eyes on as we work through the implementation of the new system. I conclude just by saying that my experience of dealing with the Commissioner and his staff has been a productive one, and I'm looking forward very much to the continuation of those discussions and consultation as we work forward from here. Thank you.
Gary Johansson, Port Adelaide Enfield Mayor. Before you mentioned that, say there is an investigation taking place and it might be of a councillor, or they may have to give evidence or whatever, they cannot tell anyone about this. They can only go and seek legal advice if they wish. Now, in a councillor's case, if they wish that legal advice to be paid for by the council, they'd have to seek approval first from administration. So that may mean that they could be at a disadvantage. It may be that they're not a guilty party, they just have to give evidence, but they may have to pay for their own legal advice. How are they going to cover this? Because a lot of times councillors don't have a lot of money, and are they able to recoup the funds? So there is a problem there that I see up front.
The Act doesn't provide for the Commissioner to provide funds for legal representation for witnesses or indeed persons whose conduct is under consideration. Those arrangements have to be made independently of the Commissioner. In making those arrangements, of course, Council will have to take into account whether it's appropriate in the particular circumstances to provide the cost of legal assistance to a particular witness, and that must depend upon the circumstances that bring that person before the Commissioner to give evidence. If that matter is outstanding and Council are considering it, I wouldn't have thought there was any difficulty in, unless there's some urgency about the giving of evidence, of the hearing being delayed until such time as as the person was able to arrange an indemnity in respect of his or her legal costs.
Would that be in breach of what you described before, talking to a third party other than...
There's a... I was just looking for the clause. Clause 7.2 allows the person who's served with a summons to make disclosure to a person or body for the purpose of determining whether the person is entitled to obtain an indemnity for legal costs.
Richard, I think.
Yeah, just if in the case of an investigation which is being done under the new elected member Code of Conduct provisions and the Local Government Act by my office, the situation is that you're quite correct about what the confidentiality are obligations attracted during that investigation. It will be an offence for anybody to disclose information that comes to their attention during the course of an Ombudsman investigation. That previously hasn't been the case, or hasn't clearly been the case. But the good news is that there is a new provision in the Local Government Act which deals with the entitlement of an elected member to get legal advice, and I think that that would be very helpful in the situation that you've outlined.
Right. Could I, we had a number of questions that have already been submitted, and there is one question that I feel is very important, and I speak here as the Dean of Law at Flinders University, but also more generally as an educationalist. The question that has come in is this: how will the public sector and the general public be educated about ICAC, and can schools be a vehicle for this educative process? Recently I was at the LITASA conference, which is how teachers who teach legal studies and civics in our schools educate the next generation. And I'd like to invite you to reflect on this challenge, because I think it's a very important one. It relates to the shift in culture. And I'm reminded of Walter Gellhorn's comment that criticising ineptitude does not necessarily create aptitude. So what can we do, panel, to educate the next generation?
They're all looking at me on this one. Look, I think that I'll speak, I guess, on the public sector, and I'll allow, I guess, the Commissioner and the Ombudsman, I guess, to talk about the detail. Often it's easy, I think, not easy, but it's easy to describe what the Act says and what's expected. But for those of us in the audience, there's a lot of grey here. And awareness raising is the things I talked about. We need to talk about what we mean by maladministration, or what we mean by misconduct, and how we together, I guess, create that definition, and more importantly, how do we then actually assess whether someone has actually breached conduct. And because I think there's a lot of confusion about what would be normal management practices as actually being behaviour that's inappropriate, and I think there's a lot of confusion. So awareness for me is basically getting people involved, having discussions about what we actually mean when we talk about misconduct, and taking, I guess, the essence of what's written in the legislation and in the Act, and actually taking it a step further. Because for those of us that have worked in areas that have investigated, there's a lot that's not in the Act that we actually then have to work out whether this was actually intentional, whether the intent was to serve the public, or in fact there was something vexatious about it. So awareness is basically, we need to get out to as many people, and that's why I look forward to working with the Commissioner in what would be, I think, a very exciting time for us to actually raise that education awareness. And as President of IPA, we've already started that journey by actually giving people as much information, and starting with something like today, hearing from the Commissioner and the Ombudsman.
Yes, well, I agree with all of that. And in fact, Irma and I met yesterday and talked about how we'd progress this. I don't think there's any medium that we should ignore for the purpose of education. And there'd be no harm in telling students what proper governance was all about, and what ethical behaviour is all about. So I would encourage schools to educate young people in relation to appropriate governance. I think what we're about is trying to develop a culture. I think a culture in the public service where the public service can recognise for itself what is appropriate or inappropriate behaviour. I think that if you get into a situation where you have to ask yourself, should I or shouldn't I do this, you shouldn't do it. If you're asking the question, the answer is no, and that's the sort of culture we've got to have amongst in the public service, so that people can recognise immediately that the particular conduct that is being contemplated would be inappropriate. I'm not saying it would be corruption, but it would just be inappropriate.
Thank you. And I would also just like to add that I think the universities, particularly Flinders University, is or sees itself very much as playing an important role in terms of educating people who do not actually only become lawyers. In fact, in a previous incarnation, I was a professor of legal ethics, and many people thought that was an oxymoron, a joke. The joke, though, and it's interesting to reflect on this, works only because of the underlying assumption that lawyers are corrupt or parasitical. And I think the real challenge is to change that and to make those jokes not funny. That's quite a difficult one, but I think the way we do that, and I am being serious now, is in terms of inculcating a set of values, a set of attitudes that I think is the bedrock that underpins the kind of conduct we expect, particularly in the public sector. I think that we all have an obligation to participate in the preventative aspects of this challenge and not simply to be investigating corruption, although we do need to clearly be alert to those risks as well. Now, are there any other questions? Yes. Yeah.
Hello, my name's Julie Thompson. I'm from Berry in the Riverland. I do just have a question, and I was hoping that Gary Burns and Sarah Bolt would be on the panel, but here it is. Is it envisaged that the new presence of ICAC will impact on the current methods and rigour of policing police? And will there be reform in the current investigative practices of the Police Complaints Authority and the Police Ombudsman, a reduction in the Police Ombudsman's unresolved outcomes, an increased expectation of the Police Commissioner to ensure the integrity and honesty of the South Australian Police Force, and changes in the culture, protection and support of in relation to whistleblowers within SAPOL? Sorry, it's a long question.
Thank you. I think that's for you, Grant.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to answer all of that, but I can say that I don't see any likelihood that we could increase the expectations of integrity within the South Australia Police, because we set the highest standards and we hold our people to account for those standards. And whistleblower protection within SAPOL is also a high priority for us, and something we take very seriously.
Thank you. Yes.
Bill Spragg, Mayor of Adelaide Hills Council. I've got a question for Richard Bingham. In relation to reports that you might prepare, you say if it's in the public interest you can release it, but you have to provide a copy of that report back to the complainant and to the agency that was being investigated. On receipt of that report, is the complainant able to make public the contents of that report independently of you?
At the conclusion of investigation, yes. If the investigation is still in train, then a complainant is in the same position as an agency. That is, it's an offence for them to use the material that comes to light during the course of that investigation. You know, if I provide them with a provisional report to enable them to respond from a natural justice point of view, it's an offence now, and it previously wasn't clearly an offence for them to take that along to the local newspaper or to do anything like that. But once the investigation is complete and I've finalised a report, my view about it is that all of the documentation which indicates what the result of the investigation was should be in the public domain.
Okay. Any other question?
Hi, Steve Atkinson from SAPOL. My question is to Mr Stevens. As we've already heard, matters will be referred back to SAPOL for investigation. SAPOL currently uses a tiering system in deciding where matters are investigated. Will the matters referred back be dealt with solely by one investigative body, or will there be a tiering system which may result in matters being sent to local LSAs?
Excuse me, it's with the removal of the ministerial directions for anti-corruption branch gives us the ability to use anti-corruption branch personnel to conduct broader investigations than simply those relating specifically to corruption. And we also have the ability to identify the most appropriate resources to conduct investigations which are referred from the ICAC.
Just to take that up, any referral that's made by me to SAPOL will be for SAPOL to determine how it will be investigated. I don't have the power, and I don't want the power, and I wouldn't exercise it, to tell SAPOL how to go about it. If it's sent to SAPOL, it's sent to SAPOL for it to decide which unit it will use to carry out the investigation.
In most cases, that will be the ACB.
Sorry.
Anne Bosio from Defeast. I've sat on a number of appeal tribunals in the past, merit, grievance, disciplinary appeal tribunals at the Industrial Court. And it's one of the things that you get a sense of is the culture within organisations. And I've taken it up with previous commissioners for public employment around how they use the cases that come before the appeal tribunals to actually really understand what's happening in agencies and things. And I'm interested whether I don't know that we have actually really used those things as case studies. And I, having been a long-term public servant, I don't think a number of the cultures within organisations have changed. So that sort of background stuff, I think, for looking at some of the cases that might come before the ICAC or other bodies.
Excellent question, if I may say so.
Can I? I'd like to start, and then I'll get the Commissioner to respond. One of the things we talked about in our conversation yesterday was how we'll work closely together, and given it's only a couple of weeks for me, and my background is around looking at cultures in organisations and developing ones that I guess are positive and are transparent and aligned with the code of ethics. And one of the things I'd like to see us do as we start on this journey is not to kind of reveal the confidential information, but more broadly, how can we work together if there is something quite systemic in organisations and it looks like it's sort of happening across the board. I think it's up to us to make sure that we address those issues if it seems to be going across a particular agency or several agencies. I think it would be remiss of us not to then try and target, I think, some of the work that we've been doing through Change at South Australia and the expectations of chief executives and senior people to inculcate all the values and behaviours that will make it into a positive culture. But I'd like the Commissioner to respond to that too.
Well, I agree with that. The commissioners. I've only been commissioner for 2 weeks, and I don't have any experience in education as such. I don't want to reinvent the wheel in relation to education. I'd want to use Irma and Irma's organisation. I'd like to use Kim Economides' organisation for the purpose of putting out education programs in relation to corruption, misconduct and maladministration. As I say, I'm not an educator, but what you said, I think, is a very sensible way to show people, and that is use experience as an indication of what is appropriate or inappropriate. Another way of doing it, which we often use in the legal profession, is hypotheticals as to what you would do given these circumstances. And I think we've probably got to be practical about telling people what they can or can't do, because some people do find it difficult to understand where the line is to be drawn. And I think practical experience to which you've referred is a very useful way of educating people.
Okay, I'm afraid time is running out, but I did just want to say that how much I agree with that last point. We have, I think, a particular opportunity in universities to use the classroom as a kind of laboratory within which to experiment with anonymized situations where you can look at ethical conflicts, problem questions, and there are no real people that are going to be directly affected. But having those discussions with seasoned practitioners and students, the next generation, is, I believe, really important because you can alert practitioners in the future to the risks that they will encounter, and that this is, I think, a very important opportunity we should take up. Well, we are in a transitional phase. I think here in South Australia, the agencies you've heard from, all of them will be feeling their way around some of these difficult boundary questions, as indeed everyone will, and that includes complainants. When is it right to complain is, I think, a very important question for every member of this state. So, let me thank again our speakers and panelists, John Rowe, the Honourable Bruce Lander, Grant Stevens, Irma Ranieri and Richard Bingham. Now, in lieu of speakers' gifts, the IPAA will be making a small donation to Bruce Lander's charity of choice, which is Adelaide's Women and Children's Hospital. So I'd like to thank you on their behalf. Again, I would like to thank IPAA's major partners, the State Government of South Australia, the Senior Management Council, the PwC, Wallmans, Technology One, and my own university. And we also acknowledge the IPAA's professional members and councillors. I'd particularly like to thank Carmel and her staff at the IPAA, the ICAC, and Jim Harnett, who headed up the Public Integrity Project team as a lead up to the 1st of September, when the Commissioner commenced in his role and the OP opened. All of whom have collaborated to bring you this, I think you'll agree, excellent event today. Now, there is an online form seeking your feedback on today's forum, which will be emailed to you, which I encourage you all to complete. Speakers' presentations will also be available on the IPAA website, I'm told, by the end of the week. And also this website will advise you of other IPAA activities which will be occurring in the near future, including the Don Dunstan oration with Annabel Crabb on the December the 9th. And please visit the ICAC website for further information on ICAC and the directions guidelines. Well, thank you all for coming, and please enjoy your day. Thank you.